Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today for Tahseen Consulting's second webinar, where we aim to demystify GCC expansion for Southeast Asian startups. My name is Fiona. I'm an advisor on tech policy and strategy here at Tahseen Consulting. So maybe I'll start by giving you some background as to why we started doing this. We decided to do this because over the years, our team has picked up on the convergence of the tech and startup ecosystems between Southeast Asia and the MENA region. We do see many opportunities there, and we're interested in exploring this convergence. I'm personally based in Singapore, and I understand that the GCC and MENA region is probably unfamiliar territory for most startups looking to expand, which can make it intimidating to make the leap from Southeast Asia to GCC. And that's why we started this series to help startups who are looking to expand on their journey. In our previous webinar, we focused on the overview of the region and why we think that expanding to the GCC could be something for startups to look at. And for this webinar, we will be hearing from entrepreneurs who have actually done it. And we have a very exciting lineup here with us today. First, we have
Hi.
Yeah. Who is the head of product at Tazapay. So Loothra will start things off with a presentation on what they do. And then we will continue with a panel discussion along with Sabah, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Touche. We will be having a discussion with them on what it takes for a startup to enter the GCC and MENA region, how to do it successfully, and the kinds of problems that they face so that other startups can possibly learn from their experiences and advice. Now I'll give the floor to Law from Tazapay, who will introduce the company and explain their product in more detail.
Sure. So should I share my screen? I'll need the host permissions, I think.
Just hang on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I have that. Let's see if you can. Just let me know if you can see my screen now.
Yeah, it's good.
Got it. Okay. So first of all, thanks everyone for joining in, and Fiona and Wes, thanks for having me here. I'll just do a quick introduction of what Tazapay does. We are a cross-border payments company. It's a bit of a mouthful to unload, so I'm just gonna use the next couple of slides to sort of explain what we are exactly doing. So the problem space that we are operating in is that cross-border merchants and marketplaces, basically were aggregating buyers and sellers on their platforms. They don't really have, payment methods which are appropriate for their problem statement, right? So either they use cards, which are very expensive and have a lot of chargebacks from a buyer side, or they use wire transfers, which take them off platform, disaggregate them, and are have inherent problems of being slow, cumbersome, and not being conducive to checkout. And they offer no protection at all, right? So from a Tazapay perspective, what we are trying to do is we are trying to build this checkout solution cross-border, built on local rail collections globally. So essentially picking up local collection rails all across the globe and solving for experience and cost, add on the protection using things like escrow, which I'll cover later. And then also, going the last mile and doing payouts in a fairly seamless and compliant fashion, right? So this is powered by, what we sort of promise our users is to give them multiple collection methods with a single Tazapay account. So powered by local bank transfer or real-time payment methods, which are available in 56 countries. We've very recently expanded to a couple of GCC countries here, MENA countries here. One of the symbols that we're seeing here is actually Fawri, which is an Egyptian payment method, right? And we are, continuing to expand in this territory because it's a fairly important geography for us. Wire transfers, of course, are still fairly important, but then the the needle mover is actually doing wire transfers in local currency and not in USD. That just helps businesses manage their local reserves a lot better. And of course, you can't really get away from credit cards for low value transactions, entry level transactions. Credit cards are always going to be important. So giving that instant settlement option and a credit option is always useful, right? So this is basically our network coverage. And then in terms of products, we expose this to our customers using APIs. They want a more bespoke experience, they can integrate with our APIs directly. And we also offer plug and play options so that they can, if they have a platform already in Shopify, WooCommerce, Magento, Wix, we are also expanding in other B2B sort of territories like Xero and QuickBooks. They can just sort of plug and play and get started with our solutions from the platforms that they're already on. So they don't need to do a fairly heavy integration, right? The other product is that, you don't have a website, you don't have a platform to integrate. And so you just, do B2B payments, and essentially you just need to send a payment link across to your buyer. That's essentially a no-code checkout. Log in with Tazapay, you get access to our payment links product, and you can, customize it and send it to your buyer and collect payments in multiple geographies throughout the world, right? And the final one, which is protection layer that we offer, is for our underlying transactions, seeing whether the transaction is actually taking place, right? And shipping is actually happening before we release the money to the seller, right? So this is our flavor of protection on top of payment methods that haven't traditionally offered protection. So you do a wire transfer, you do a local payment method, you add on escrow as a protected payment option on top of it, and suddenly you have protection baked into a product or a payment method which didn't have protection built in as a value prop from the start, right? So we do a lot of integration to support verification, proofs, and seeing whether the actual shipment happened before we release the money to the seller. That sort of gives protection to both the buyers and the sellers. So yeah, that's pretty much a very quick overview of what we are doing. Didn't want to take up too much time, Fiona. So I'll just pass the control back to you.
Yeah, just a moment while I pull up the screen. Okay, thank you, Lof. I think that was a very interesting presentation. Thanks for telling us about the exciting project that you are working on. And I would like to welcome on our panel Sabah as well. Sabah co-founded Touche, which is a fintech startup that provides F&B and hospitality businesses a mobile smart payment terminal, and has led its GCC expansion, including forming flagship partnerships with leading GCC banks such as Mashreq and QNB. So welcome both of you on the panel, and I think we are very excited to hear your insights, especially with your experiences in starting and scaling businesses globally. Sabah, maybe let's start with you. What advice would you give to earlier stage founders and startups looking to expand to the GCC region? Maybe like, what is the first step you think they should take when they explore GCC expansion, and what do you think their pathway should be?
Good afternoon, everyone. I think, talking about GCC is a bit difficult because it's just like talking about ASEAN, right? It's many markets with different dynamics, different regulations, and therefore, I think you need to be very focused. You need to do some analysis around what is your target market, where you believe you will get the best traction, and find partners, right, that can actually push the agenda. Unless you're a very well-established and well-funded company, that can create, a major presence in the market before you start, it is always advisable, in my view at least, to have partnerships with people that have presence, that have attraction in the market as far as their name and innovation capabilities are concerned. But my first point would be, don't treat GCC as a homologous homogeneous thing. It is actually many different markets with different dynamics and different levels of maturity. And therefore, you got to be looking at your product and capabilities and services and what you want to actually offer the market, and find the right landing place.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think some of the founders that we have talked to also mentioned about like homogeneous markets and how like the GCC is I mean, when we say GCC, there are many areas that we need to look at that the market can differ greatly. And I think forming strategic partnerships is very important if you want to expand to the region. So Love, will you agree with what Sabah said? And do you have anything to add?
No, absolutely. I think that's a fairly pertinent point. I've experienced some of this firsthand. Let me give you an anecdote. So essentially, when we talk about payments, right? So, and as I mentioned in my deck, we are looking to partner with local payment providers and seeing some of the local payment options, and that can be very dynamic, right, across the region. So you have one geography like Egypt, for instance, where you have payment methods such as Fori, which are essentially offline ticketing based systems, and you have another market where you have a fairly seamless transaction through maybe like M-Pesa or some other QR code based mechanism. So even in payments, it's like you have to think about the market that you're solving for very, very particularly. It's not like you can't treat the entire region as like Sabah said, as a homogeneous thing. You have to think about the problem you're solving and the market that you are entering, and really enter that market and get that right before you move on to some other GCC market that you are targeting. So totally aligned.
Yeah, great answers from both of you. I think those are definitely some things that to keep in mind for startups looking to expand. And also, I guess that something that founders will be very curious about is getting investments. And we see that both of you attracted some very impressive investors. So maybe you can tell us more about what advice you would give founders who are trying to raise funding from Tier 1 global VCs, GCC investors, and experienced operators and advisors. And also, with the current climate, do you think that sovereign wealth funds will continue to provide funding?
Who do you want to start, Fiona?
Whoever is fine. Maybe Sabah can start. Yeah.
Look, so we thankfully didn't need funding at an early stage. Therefore, we stayed away from the VC community, and we were always looking for strategic investors, right? I think the challenge with trying to find investors at a very early stage, obviously the risk for the investor is a lot higher, and therefore the stake they want for the amount that they invest is much greater. Okay. I personally think, at least for our company, I'm not one to try and actually advise others, because I think each company is very different, and the dynamics are again, have different elements to us. So for us, it was crucial to actually have investors that we were partnering with, right? And these are well-known names that have a big slice of the market, and their endorsement through this investment is actually quite crucial, because it is not just a financial investment, but it's a partnership that we've embarked on. We're continuing with our Series A, and we're now talking to certain family offices that have proximity into the areas where our business delivers functionality and benefits to. So we have been on the path of strategic investors and partnerships, and that's what's worked for us. From a sovereign wealth fund, the ticket size that they will look at historically has been relatively large, and therefore, we didn't find them in the first instance, both in Singapore as well as the UAE, to be in our sweet spot as far as investors were concerned, right? You always, we had the feeling that we weren't always, we were either B2B where they invested in B2C, or, we were too early stage, or we were too late stage. We never found a sweet spot, talking to the sovereign wealth funds. But that doesn't mean that it won't work for others. So I basically shared our experience. Our experience has been to focus on partners that can actually invest, and therefore they have benefits beyond the financial gains.
Yeah. Love, what do you think?
I would pretty much agree. I mean, like, sovereign wealth funds are something that we are not actively looking at, right? So we are essentially looking at your tier one VCs globally to raise money from, because essentially it's because we are building a global network, so it sort of makes it sort of obvious that we need to have like connects and networks and essentially all economies in the world. So having potentially strategic partners who are also investors is the key for us. And again, agree with Saba that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all advice that you can provide to people, but I would say that you need to focus on, if you're raising money and you have the wherewithal to survive for a while, that's great. But whenever you feel that you need to raise money, it's always best to have a strategic backer on your board rather than somebody who's just going to invest for the sake of it.
Yeah, completely agree. So I guess we know that the current market is not looking great right now, and VCs are providing a lot of advice to founders about like how to make it through the current pullback. And from your perspective, what are you seeing on the ground, and how bad is it out there for founders?
Let me take a stab at that, and then Saba can share his views. So,
yeah.
So what at least we are seeing right now is that all of the investors in general are investors, and investors in general are essentially sharing a lesson of prudence. Just be prudent with your spend. So instead of focusing, so for us, what that means is that instead of focusing on creating different product lines and doing too much experimentation with product lines at this point in time, what we have chosen to instead do is focus on optimizing and getting the best possible customer experience delivered to our customers who are already with us, right? And trying to get the maximize revenue from our existing product lines, right? So that's essentially the advice that we have been getting. Be prudent in the sort of areas that you are dabbling into at this point in time, and then but wherever you see opportunities, don't let those opportunities go as well, because this is like the advice that we constantly get at this point in time is that this is basically a show of character at this point, and folks who are able to survive at this point in time will come out on the other side with a fairly large war chest and war stories to sort of ensure that long-term survival is essentially guaranteed. So maybe Saba, you want to add something?
Yeah, look, we have scars on our backs to actually show how difficult it's been over the past few years. Like, if you look at our business sector, where we're focusing on F&B and hospitality, COVID just about killed that sector in many markets. And that's why the reason we actually started focusing on Middle East and Europe, because Singapore was very, very highly affected through the approach that they took to the quarantine and what have you. So I think you need to be agile as a company. I think in many ways, obviously stick to your knitting and start expanding on the core product that you have into more clients and into more markets. But also you need to be opportunistic, right? So, you know, one of the things, again, if you like an example, soon after we entered the UAE market, we started focusing on the Qatari market because of the World Cup. And you know, after about a year and a half of actually working and building partnerships, we're about to sign our first customers. Also other things. I think a lot of the business ideas have a gestation period. Market expansions have obviously gestation periods. So do not expect immediate success in a given market. And you need to be in it for the long run. Now, as far as the market conditions are concerned, from an investor point of view, if you think about what I actually mentioned earlier, where we are, you know, focused on partners and focused on investors that have, you know, they are in the sort of business that we actually create functionality, provide functionality to. The investment decision is very different than just a pure, you know, balance sheet analysis and that level of investment, right? Because they can see benefits from using Touche. So I think, again, going back to my earlier point, you need to be selective about the people that you talk to about investments. And I think investment's still out there, right? Market conditions are tight, but, you know, if you have the right product, the right partners, you will find the right investors.
Yeah, I agree. So I think maybe other than in the right investors, is it also important to engage with the right government entities maybe? So we do work with a lot of early stage startups who want to enter the region. And we always emphasize the importance of speaking with regulators and lawmakers and ensuring that these people are on board with what you are doing. So how important do you guys think it is for startups to engage with government and government-linked investors and entities as they enter and scale in the GCC? Is it different from Southeast Asia or India, since a lot of you are based there?
Loothra, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So basically, when it comes to like geographies like India and Southeast Asia, the regulators honestly are fairly independent, right? So you can, the benefit of having a strategic investor on board is, at least in my experience, limited to getting the right connects and understanding the regulations that they're putting out, right? But at the end of the day, the investors aren't really going to help you bypass the regulations in any way at all, right? So the best way that you can solve this problem is to have a strategic investor on board who can sort of pre-warn you about some of these things, or sort of give you a insight into the market that, hey, these are the kind of regulations that you need to take care of. But essentially, you are the one running the business, right? And I'll give you an example right now. So RBI has recently come up with a circular saying that prepaid instruments in India can't really be loaded, using a credit line, right? And that has essentially sent the entire fintech ecosystem in India into a tizzy. And essentially, startups and investors across the board are affected by the decision. So at this point in time, there isn't really too much that the fintechs can do other than understand what the regulation is all about and how to mitigate the regulation by making a change in their product or their service, or by essentially figuring out, what pivot they can do if their existing business model isn't really in line with the regulations. So I would say that while it is important to have a strategic investor on board who can help you in the time guide through the regulatory environments, I would always err on the side of caution when it comes to building a product, always upfront in line with what the regulations are going to be all about. Sava, you want to probably add something?
So we basically strategically, when we built the solution, we built it in such a way that we are ring-fenced from the regulatory side of things, right? So, we do not need any regulatory approval to enter any given market because the actual payment side of things is done through our partners. And therefore, this has not been something that we've had to worry about. So I can't really share my opinion on the regulatory side of things. Having worked with regulators in the old days, when I worked for banks, they are not the most, at least in the old days, and I don't want to generalize, they were not the most innovative, quick to decide entities, right? So, so I think if you do need regulatory approval for your solution, it's something you need to start building in into your plans for a market entry right up front, because it will take a lot longer than you expect.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess moving on to the next question, we actually look at some of the Southeast Asian startups which have expanded to the GCC over the last several years. And we realized that most of them expanded to just the UAE. So in your opinion, what challenges do startups typically face when you enter and scale in the GCC? And do you think that since 79% of Southeast Asia startups that expanded to the GCC actually only entered the UAE, do you think that this is the start of an emerging trend where these startups increasingly see the UAE as perhaps a more favorable place to set up base for global expansion than Singapore?
Look, I think I'm a living example. I actually shifted my base from Singapore to Dubai. Yeah. Because our focus currently is on Middle East and Europe, right? And both from a time zone distance point of view, it's a lot more optimal to be based here. UAE, I think, is the natural landing place for most people. It's a very open, advanced economy. The living conditions are what we used to in other markets, pretty high level of living standards. And therefore, I think it's normal for people to start here. But I think it's a major mistake to purely focus on UAE. I think there's huge opportunities in the GCC. When you think about Saudi, by far the biggest economy in the GCC, I think that has to be on everyone's radar. But the advice that I would have is to make sure you're absolutely ready and you have the right partners before you enter that market. If you look at Qatar, one of the biggest gas producers in the world, one of the highest standards of living, GDP standards in the world, it has to be on people's radar. When you think about other GCC economies, they're probably a bit smaller. But just focusing on UAE, I think, is a mistake. It could be the landing area. So you start here, you build your partnerships and your businesses here to start with, and then leverage the relationships you build out of the UAE to help you expand into other markets. I think UAE alone would be a mistake.
Love, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, let me add to that. And my experience has actually been slightly different. In fact, when we expanded to the GCC and MENA area, our first markets were actually the Egyptian market and the Jordanian market, right? So even though we have a presence, in terms of payment methods and payment options in UAE, our first markets where we are getting real traction from are actually Egypt and Jordan, right? So again, as I mentioned before, both of these geographies have been very different from each other. So figuring out what are the nuances of these two geographies have themselves sort of made us understand a lot of how the payments in the region operate, right? So for instance, how do offline payments work? How do voucher-based payments work, right? And so once we sort of figure that out, we can use the learnings to apply the same in other markets within the GCC. So honestly speaking, I wouldn't really say, restrict your expansion plans to even start with UAE. We just followed the money, right? So where our first customers came in from, where we saw the first bigger buyer opportunities in terms of expanding our payment network, that's where we went, right? And that sort of gave us a safeguard that, hey, you spend all of that time and effort to expand in that region. You should probably start seeing results and revenue soon after, right? So although it may make logical sense from the outside to just expand to UAE, because obviously it's like a fairly important economy in the region, and it's not like we are not going to expand there. I would say, look at your own customer data, you look at your own product product market fit in that particular region, and then expand accordingly. So you may wasn't big enough there.
Yeah, I think both of you made excellent points. I guess many people just see UAE as like a good starting point to explore like the rest of the region. I mean, as you say, the market is big and diverse, and there are a lot of opportunities there. So I guess that sort of flows into my next question as well, that there has been a lot of movement happening in this region to make it like more tech friendly. And from our research, we also found that about 60% of Southeast Asian startups that enter the GCC are actually fintech startups. So like both of you also from fintech startups. And there are also more Web3 and crypto players coming recently, especially with Dubai setting up its virtual assets regulatory authority a few months back. So what do you think are some areas of opportunity in fintech and Web3, and in particular that you see in this region for startups? For Tazapay, for example, so we know that the India and UAE recently signed the SEPA, so the closer, And do you think that this is a very significant opportunity? And how has Tazapay sort of managed to leverage the connection between India and Southeast Asia and Middle East?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so look, like, from the previous question, of course, when we look to this economy and this geography before, obviously our first thought was, let's go to UAE as well. But we found that the money was in other geographies, so we expanded there. But that doesn't mean that, as I said, UAE is not an important economy for us. The SEPA agreement that you mentioned is actually going to pump in about $100 billion in the next 5 years within these two regions in terms of trade. And essentially, that's the thing that we are solving for, right? Cross-border trade, right? So India has always had a fairly favorable relationship when it comes to UAE in terms of being a fairly large export market here. And as we solve for compliant payouts in India, and we solve for expanding our payment network in UAE, it's essentially just gonna make it easier for us to leverage the opportunity that is going to come as a way of SEPA, because whether it comes to exports of commodities or exports of services, essentially payments are going to be ubiquitous needs in both cases. So I think that that particular agreement is going to be fairly helpful to us, and is in line with the expansion plans that we have for the geography.
I really have no views on this, Fiona, to be quite honest with you. I think the regulatory environment in most trading blocks, I think, will converge, right? You will have not only this bipartisan trade agreements, but also, I think, between blocks of countries. So I think they will converge. I think there will be more proximity between them. And that actually facilitates, right, the expansion of our businesses once you get into one, through that proximity and convergence, and similar environments from a regulatory point of view, you can actually expand into multiple markets relatively quickly. But beyond that, I have no specific views on this.
Okay, sure. Maybe can let us know whether you think there are any areas of tech that you think the UAE can learn from Southeast Asia and India?
That's an interesting one. Let me take a stab at it, Fiona.
Yeah.
So I think over the years, one of the biggest, like, let me take the example of India. One of the biggest products that has come out from our geography is UPI, which is like a unified payments interface, allows people to make payments instantly to each other as a P2P option, or to merchants as a sort of a P2M option. And I think that that has really skyrocketed in terms of adoption in India. And I feel that the framework which led to the creation of UPI is the framework which I feel that other geographies, not just UAE, but other geographies can emulate. So essentially in India, a think tank has been set up, right? So iSpirit and similar think tanks across, which are innovating in the area of payments, in the area of credit, in the area of insurance, right? And how this can not just benefit the tier 1 cities, right, and the top investment areas in India, but also the masses, right? And these folks, these think tanks are coming up with frameworks which help in the creation of the technology and the APIs around it, which then sees wider acceptance by the rest of the startups in the region. So I think that, again, as I mentioned, it's not just UAE which can learn from this. There are other geographies which are trying to emulate a similar model, creating their own think tanks which can come together and create standardized frameworks and APIs which other startups can build their app layers on top of. So I think that's one area where, at least in my opinion, GCC and other geographies can really benefit out of this.
Yeah, of course. That's a great answer. Saba, since you moved from Southeast Asia to the UAE, I guess maybe is there anything that you noticed?
Look, to be quite honest with you, nothing that jumps at me greatly. I think if you look in the government sector, Singapore obviously is quite advanced from having services available online to the citizens and residents. I think UAE is on a path to actually get there as well. So I think the challenge always is not to be the first, but to be a quick follower. And I think there's absolutely a willingness by the authorities here to not only innovate in their own right together with companies from outside of the region, but also to see what works in other countries and follow up pretty quickly, right? So there are certain things here, for example, which are even more advanced than Singapore, like road pricing, right? So in Singapore we still have those machines with the bloody card inside. Here it's all automatic through your number plate, and you get charged. So there are things that are more advanced. There are things that countries like India or Singapore could be more advanced. But I think it's also a matter of the dynamics of a nation, right? If you look at the population here, it's predominantly expats. And therefore, they have requirements which the government is addressing here. I think the banking apps here are a bit behind times. If you look at their apps, they're still pretty basic and not very user friendly. So absolute certain areas which I think they can follow, but certain areas I think they're more advanced than many markets.
Yeah. I think you made a great point there about how it's about who can follow up the fastest, right? So I guess one last question before we end off will be, which country do you think will ultimately win the GCC race to be the region's tech hub, the UAE or Saudi Arabia?
I don't have a crystal ball, to be quite honest with you, and I don't think, or I don't know why there needs to be one hub, right? Any country can actually create a presence in this space, right? I know Bahrain, for example, is trying hard to reinvent themselves and to become a hub as well. So I don't think necessarily, and we've seen this in many of the other regions, where you don't really end up with one hub, one winner, one loser. You have multiple hubs that create expertise around certain areas, and they can continue to cooperate and compete at the same time. So I don't think it's one or the other, and I think that there could be other players beyond Saudi and UAE as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we've seen this happen in other regions as well. So Southeast Asia, for example, Singapore is a hub for fintech, and you have Vietnam emerging as a hub for logistics. See Indonesia emerging with so many, again, fintech startups and e-commerce startups. So all three regions at this point in time are doing very well as hubs in their own right. So I'll in fact be cheering for both Saudi Arabia and UAE, and sort of figuring out if there is a market for us in both economies. So yeah, I totally agree with what Saba has to say.
Yeah, I agree too. I guess there's a lot that each market can learn from the other market, and also like between the Middle East and Southeast Asia, there's also a lot that both regions can learn from each other in terms of tech and entrepreneurship. And yeah, we'll be keeping a close eye on both regions.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that, I would like to thank both of you for being with us here today. It was great having you here, and I really enjoyed chatting with both of you and hearing your insights on your expansion journey. And I'm sure that the startups who are here with us today, like this will benefit them if they're thinking of expanding but are uncertain of how to do so. And before we end this webinar, I'll also quickly run through how Tahseen Consulting can help tech companies with a variety of things that we talked about previously. So this can range from mapping opportunities to formulating narratives for engagement with stakeholders, such as regulators, and implementing escalation strategies for government action and helping to influence regulations, or push for regulations where there are none, or push back against regulations that increase compliance costs or stifle growth. And if anybody wants to talk more about this, feel free to drop me an email, and I'll be more than happy to have a chat or answer any questions that you may have. So again, I would like to thank Love and Saba for taking the time to be with us here today. It has been a pleasure. So have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.